Order, and welcome to today's Energy Security and Net Zero Select Committee hearing on the Severn Estuary tidal power plans. We're here to discuss the Commission's recommendations in detail regarding the feasibility and benefits of tidal range energy in the Severn Estuary, and this follows a report recommending its development in March. And I'd like to welcome our first panel, and I will ask you to introduce yourselves before we start with the questioning. So we will start on this side, please.
Thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Sarah Williams-Gardner, and I'm the chair of the Western Gateway, who is the organisation that commissioned the report.
Thank you for the invite. My name's Shaun Gaffey. I'm a chartered town planner working with RSPB Cymru. I basically oversee planning, policy and casework at RSPB Cymru, and I've been feeding in on the final recommendations report. Good to meet you.
Great, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Athanasios Angeloudis. I'm a reader at the School of Engineering at the University of Edinburgh. I have 10 years of experience in tidal energy, more than 10 years right now. And pertinent to this project, I have been funded by the Natural Environment Research Council for a large part of this period to look into optimizing tidal range schemes in terms of their environmental impacts, their performance, and their feasibility as a whole.
Well, thank you all very much. You are extremely welcome. And I'll start the questioning with some questions about the viability of tidal range in the Severn Estuary. And previously we've heard numerous attempts to develop tidal range technology in the estuary. Why is it different this time?
I'm guessing This is directed to me. So that is a very good question, because I can confirm that the technology is perfectly viable. It's proven. There are projects around the world that basically can demonstrate this at a large scale, not just at a pilot scale. I believe that there have been a number of recommendations that have been made in the past, and these are echoed by the Severn Estuary Commission. One of the challenges has been that some of those recommendations have not been taken forward. This is just one aspect. Another aspect is that many of the projects that we have considered in the past were not necessarily the best project for the Severn Estuary, considering its importance. So the idea, the key point is that the technology is viable, but we also need a very good project for it.
Okay. Yes.
I think I would add to that the Western Gateway, which represents 28 local authorities which span the estuary and the two governments, were very keen to appoint an independent commission to have a look at the viability, and that commission actually used a lot of evidence that had gone before it, but they proactively went out to 200 stakeholders, 500 individuals, of which many environmentalists were approached proactively to be part of this decision. You know, recommendations have been made before, but actually working collaboratively is really, really important. And you'll see in the recommendations, and some of my Commissioner colleagues will talk you through them in detail later, the recommendations have come to the conclusion as a consensus from all of those varied parties, and I think that is a very different approach this time round.
Yes.
I think you pose a very good question, really, and we would, as the RSPB, probably echo that. It's obviously it's not for us to comment on whether or not the technology is feasible, but and as set out in the report's own findings, there are significant gaps in environmental data, and addressing these gaps is crucial to enable proper consideration of the development within the estuary. So just as an example, gaps include, robust and up-to-date detail around impacts on bird and fish species. Same goes for long-term wider impacts in the estuary and beyond, as well as, evidence that shows that compensation for projects such as these is deliverable, really. But yeah, just to, echo Sarah here in terms of early collaboration and things like that. That's something that we would strongly recommend.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. The Commission says that circumstances have sufficiently changed from previous attempts to deliver the development to reconsider the case. Previously, there were financial concerns. You briefly mentioned there, Shaun, the environmental impact, but there was also the need for subsidies was something that was raised. And combined, those factors have consistently halted progress. Is the Commission right that things really have changed enough to make this happen?
I mean, I think it still looks to be a very costly process on the face of it. You know, I think I can't remember the exact details, but you know, a barrage would be 33 billion at a conservative estimate. So yeah, again, I'm not an economist, so probably not the best person to talk about the cost thing. But I think those issues do remain really, and need to be demonstrated that they can be overcome.
Yeah, Athanasios.
If I can add on this, one of the things that is an issue is we have to deal with the legacy of the projects. That the number that was just quoted, 33 billion for a barrage, this is not something that is on the table, and it's not something that the Severn Estuary Commission recommended. In fact, we want to move away from those large-scale projects, and this is basically what the Severn Estuary Commission said, to look at more kind of efficient designs, more environmentally sustainable designs. Now, the other thing is in terms of the circumstances that changed, we have commitments in terms of net zero, and one of the plans that we have by that point is the contribution of tidal energy in the UK as a whole. And if we want to basically to use tidal energy as a large-scale kind of like solution to contribute to this effort, there is no doubt that developing a tidal range energy in the Severn Estuary will basically help you towards the net zero goals.
Or is there anything the Commission hasn't considered that you think they should have done?
One of the things that that wasn't on the remit of the Severn Estuary Commission was to look at individual projects, and correctly, basically, they correctly state that the values of the projects there are quite indicative because they need to basically take further studies. Now, as we've seen here, we've seen basically the quote of the 33 billion scheme, which was deemed not feasible, taken out of context for this discussion. So I think it's important to take the recommendations to their own, and looking forward, we need to basically have a credible and robust scheme to go forward. But that was one of the things that I would like to highlight, because the values of 33 billion was in the description of this event for this session, and actually that is in contradiction to what the Severn Estuary Commission noted.
Sure. And what are the lessons from the Severn Estuary project for other possible tidal schemes?
So the Severn barrage and the larger barrage options effectively disrupt the movement of tidal flow in the estuary. This is what's causing a lot of the environmental impact. And also it blocks the pathways for very migratory pathways, and those are basically credible concerns that we need to basically address in the follow-up. Now, the tidal lagoon concept is an evolution of this, because basically we try to basically design those schemes in a way that they can avoid these environmental impacts. We don't want to basically the turbines to be in the roots of the migratory pathways, and we basically want to make sure that other aspects such as sedimentation are not so specific. So in order to address those will need to be looked at an individual site case. But there is no doubt that you can design feasible, credible options as tidal lagoons. But I think it's good to hear the Severn Estuary Commission's recommendation to step away from those large-scale ambitious projects, because they will not get us anywhere.
And you think that's learning for elsewhere as well?
I think this is useful to learn from us, because one of the challenges that we've faced is that we associate the impacts of the barrages with the impacts of the lagoons, and those are completely different matters.
Sarah, anything to add?
Yeah, look, I think they come back to what I said. I think they engaged with a lot of stakeholders in the early stages, something that some of the other projects might not have done so proactively. Times have changed. And you have a consensus, as said, the report, which was independent, and you'll see the commissioners and be able to talk to them later, are experts in their own fields, and we did that intentionally. And as 28 local authorities, which is the representation of the Western Gateway, the findings were put to all of those members of our pan-regional partnership, and there was agreement that now is the time to actually look to a commercially viable project to get something off the ground. There is more learning, there is more data that is required to possibly do larger projects, but we need to start with something, and hence the reason why the commercially viable project was recommended. I mean, there are other recommendations that the Commission came up with, and one of those is quite significant, and that is to recognise tidal range as part of the energy mix taking us forward. It is already recognised in the Welsh Government, and we've seen another investment today made in Ynys Môn with the Welsh Government for tidal stream, a different type of tidal energy. But we want to work together. This is an opportunity for the UK to be at the forefront of tidal energy. You know, we have the largest tidal range in the Severn Estuary, second largest in the world and the largest in the UK. So this is something that's reliable. It's something that we can sort of work with. Whereas with all of it just will be part of the mix for all of the renewable energy. But as I said, the recommendation is very clearly to actually look to do something, to take the stakeholders together on that journey, to create a vehicle that can actually bring the stakeholders together, the academics, the environmentalists, you know, the economists, because this potentially has a significant economic impact to the local area. And we looked at the impact, the potential for economic impact in the widest of senses. So not just the energy that can be generated, but also the jobs and the high-value manufacturing that could be brought to that area where there's already quite a good skill set for some of that, and where we're seeing there's some complementary skills that can fit with offshore floating wind. So there's huge positive reasons for this, but it feels as though the time is now to take some action.
Thank you, and then Shaun, before I move on.
Yes, just to sort of respond and clarify the position from the RSPB's perspective. Obviously, we welcome the recommendation in terms of, the acknowledgement that a barrage would be very difficult to deliver in terms of compensation requirements, and it's all set out in the report. But just to sort of push back on the lagoon point, really, is that obviously in short, our position is that the evidence suggests that tidal lagoons can, in principle, be delivered in a way that's less harmful to biodiversity than barrages. However, it's not to say that we'd be supportive of tidal lagoons in all locations and in high concentrations. So, just as an example from past studies, Welsh Government's draft marine plan initially included a policy that would support a fleet of tidal lagoons in Wales. The detailed assessment that accompanied that plan could not rule out damage to more than 70 of the most important designated wildlife sites, including special protection areas, special areas of conservation and Ramsar sites in all 4 countries of the UK, the Republic of Ireland, and as far as afield as France. Consequently, the adopted plan now acknowledges that there is a degree of complexity and uncertainty associated with the sustainable development of tidal lagoons around the Welsh coast. So, and it advocates for more research. So basically our position is a sort of precautionary one, in that we don't object in principle to tidal lagoons, and we are fully on board with the net zero agenda, but it needs to be these sites need to be carefully located.
Thank you very much. You're all starting to anticipate very well the questions my colleagues are going to. We're planning to ask you, which saves them asking them. I'll move on to Claire Young then.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to the panel. If I could ask Dr. What was it again? Athanasios, sorry. To start with, obviously you'd agree that tidal range engine in Severn could create predictable low-carbon energy independent of weather conditions. But do you agree with the Commission's assessment of the amount of energy that could be generated?
Depending on the kind of schemes that you will deploy, you basically have a proportional energy yield. So if I were to provide an estimate, if we basically look to the future and we can let's say that the tidal lagoon option is viable, a commercial demonstrator project goes ahead, and that would be in then I could imagine that the Severn Estuary could accommodate through lagoons specifically in the order, let's say, with the deployment of 5.27 gigawatts or something, then that could translate to about 3% of the annual UK's electricity in this way. Now, if you push it further, you can get more energy, but then that would basically lead to more environmental impacts, and I do not think that would something that I would recommend. But you can get a substantial amount of energy through there, and by trying to basically provide credible schemes that look into the environmental impact as well to minimize it as much as possible.
Would you say the technology involved in the construction of either tidal barrages or lagoons is sufficiently proven?
Absolutely. We do have schemes that have been operating around the world. There are differences because some of those schemes are very old, and right now we're more environmentally conscious. But many of those technologies have evolved. So I think that for the commercial demonstrator project, we can rely on existing technologies and try to basically, and we can basically produce a viable scheme without any particular further research, because that adds uncertainty in the process, and make sure that we get this right for any subsequent, if those exist, projects.
The report references previous consideration of a tidal reef, which I understand is a sort of subset of barrage in some ways. Should the Commission have considered that in more depth?
I mean, I've looked at the tidal reef concept in the past. There haven't been detailed analysis on the viability of this concept. But one of the things is that the tidal reef still spans the entire width of the estuary, and that I expect would be more damaging than the tidal lagoon option. And also, it involves technology for turbines that do not exist. So that would basically is something that we do not know so much about the cost and the impacts of such a scheme at the moment.
And did you want to come in?
No, you carry on.
So the Commission didn't consider flood protection, but did make some comments about it being a significant function of a tidal range structure. Do you agree with this?
I think this echoes the work of the Henry Review a few years back, when it was saying that a tidal range scheme should basically be assessed based on its primary function, which was basically the power generation aspect of it. And I think that this is correct. I could basically list a number of benefits that both associated with flood protection, definitely that is one, but there is a host of other concepts. But in order to keep us focused, I think we need to focus on the power generation side of things. There are obviously aspects that could be additional benefits to such a development.
Okay. I don't know if Shaun or Sarah want to add anything on the flood.
Yeah, just on the flood risk point, the RSPB did sort of commission a study. It's quite old now, a bit like a lot of the data in the Severn, where it compared a barrage. I know that we're not discussing a barrage here, with the Eastern Scheldt in the Netherlands, which is primarily a flood defence. But there have been some sort of unforeseen consequences that have arisen from that in terms of erosion and flood risk in different places. In terms of tidal lagoons, the data appears to show, a bit more variance, and it depends on where these lagoons are sited. So it comes back to that original point that initial site selection is vital, because some lagoons can exacerbate flood risk and some lagoons can, alleviate flood risk. So I think, again, just to repeat that point, really.
Okay. Thank you. Vera Hophouse.
Thank you. So we've already gone into some of the environmental concerns, and if I hear you, Shaun, correctly, barrage, absolutely not in the views of the RSPB. Lagoons, maybe, but you still have concerns. So I think Chair, we can sort of leave that question because it has already been answered. But I would like to understand that concerns, and I asked all of you, have been raised about missing environmental data. And do you think that actually we could progress the project before we have the data, or should we have more research and more understanding about the environmental impact?
Personally, I think there's an opportunity to continue what's happened to date with the Commission, which is running things alongside each other. I think if you try and do these things sequentially, you're going to be waiting many more years. And I think what we've seen with the Commission is that proactivity and the collaboration between organisations. And I think there is a sort of an agile approach that could be taken here, where you work very well with other stakeholders. And so rather than doing it sequentially, you can actually do things at the same time, would be my view, with a view to learning, getting the data, learning, collaborating, sharing, and making agreed decisions to go forward.
Of course, the whole point about doing it consequently is that first to find out whether the impact is too high, so we wouldn't go ahead with the project. Whereas if you run it parallel, there's almost an assumption that the project is going ahead. And yes, you're collecting the data at the same time, but on the whole, the decision to go ahead has been made. Isn't that where the issue would be, particularly when the public looks at this?
Well, I think there are gaps in the data, and maybe Shaun can actually fill that in. I don't think we've got no data at all. There are gaps in the data.
Yeah,
for
but
sure.
The gaps, even the gaps, needs to be filled in. I mean, I asked you first, and then Shaun, if you come in as well.
So one thing is that obviously there's going to be a feasibility study before any particular scheme progresses, and that would involve extensive data gathering, and there is no question about this. The other aspect of it is that it will be essential for any project to basically have a monitoring plan to basically reflect on any adverse effects that the development could have. Before that, however, we do have done a lot of research on modelling, and we basically can predict many of the impacts that might stem from these projects. And basically, when we go and consider those schemes, we basically do run models that can tell us what the potential impact be in terms of physical terms and so forth. Many of those processes are quite uncertain, but considering that you have all these tools with you, the feasibility studies, the monitoring, and the modeling work, which will get updated as more monitoring takes place, I think that provides you with a safe pathway to proceed.
Could you be very precise about what is actually the data? What are we looking, what is the missing data? Some data already exists. What is the missing data? What are you concerned about, or what is the RSPB concerned about, Shaun?
So yeah, from the RSPB's perspective, I think we would recommend that there needs to be some initial data gathering, from a bird species perspective, because the Severn is incredibly important non-breeding site for waders and wildfowl. I won't list all the species, but there are lots. And so, just as an example, I can share this report with you all after. But there was a report commissioned in 2015. Appreciate, again, it's fairly sort of dated, but it's as recent as we've got. And impacts of a lagoon on bird species include disturbance, loss of and changes to intertidal habitat, changes to salt marsh, changes to fish population, changes to freshwater wetlands, far-field changes in water levels, and displacement effects. So in order that the impact of these potential effects on birds can be assessed through EIA, Environmental Impact Assessment, and also that impacts on the specific features of designated sites can be assessed through HRA, it's necessary that baseline data is gathered on a number of scales. So there's 4 scales. So it would be within the area of a proposed tidal power lagoon, within the area of the Severn Estuary as a whole, within the wider Severn Estuary floodplain, and at other sites out with the Severn Estuary. So I think what's important is that a whole estuary approach is taken to data gathering, so that we can understand where these best sites could potentially be.
And Sarah, when you say there's already quite a lot of data, which is the data that already exists?
I think there was a lot of learning from the Swansea project, but when I talk about these things happening consecutively, I'm talking about progressing policy and actually seeing tidal in the policy as well as doing the data gathering for the birds in the estuary. That there are some of the recommendations we've got in here. I think we can sort of move at the same time, because legislation and actually getting tidal recognised is another piece that we need to do, whilst we're also understanding where the impacts will be on the environment. And we know that the estuary is as Shaun has already said, is a really valuable and highly sort of special area, and nobody wants to have an adverse impact on that. But at the same time, we're balancing climate change, we're balancing net zero, and when, having a commercially viable project where we can work together and learn together, I think is it needs to happen. Personally, I think the Commission was very clear, and it needs to happen now. But I think there are some things that can happen in parallel, and more on the policy side, so maybe I was a bit misleading on that.
I mean, you have already anticipated my last question around, do you think that there's a right balance between local environmental impacts and the national need for clean power? And I think I hear from what you're saying, although not all data has been gathered and all environmental impacts fully understood, you think there is a right balance between the two?
I think there has been the right balance. I think the Commission have approached it in the right way. I think they've worked very collaborative and proactively, not only with environmentalists, but also from an economic perspective. That we have a significant amount of commercial activity in the estuary that comes through the ports. These are really important to the local area, to the jobs in the local area and supply chains. And all of these things have been taken into account. I said, well, it's not, it's not a light piece of work to engage with 200 stakeholders and 500 individuals and take all of those into account. Personally, I know the Commission have been out and spoken to the ports. I've also been to the ports and spoken to many people around the estuary, and they've been really heartened by the fact that they have been listened to in this report, and therefore the support, and I said the support from the Western Gateway, which is 28 local authorities and 2 governments and multiple political parties, has been to support the recommendations in this independently commissioned report.
You're nodding, so I assume that we need to move on. I was just sort of possibly asking Shaun to maybe contradict. I don't know. What's your view?
I mean, if I can say something, as an academic myself, I would always ask for more data for my research, but in some cases it becomes non-practical and prohibitive for something to progress. So I think we need to find a right balance, and enabling a commercial demonstrator project and providing this project delivery vehicle the Commission provides would enable us to develop something and for us to learn from this for more subsequent projects. I do worry that trying to basically have a perfect understanding of the site, that is something that is almost an impossibility for estuaries as a whole. So we need to find a balance of what is possible to achieve. And considering the deadlines that we have for net zero, I do think that this is something that we need to start acting on now.
Great. We'll move on. Mike Reid has got some questions on habitat.
Can I just ask a quick question on the data, Chair, if that's okay?
Very, very quick.
Shaun, you said the data was from 2015?
Yes.
Somehow we can ascertain from that these projects are going to be harmful to wildlife. Are there rare species at stake? What's at stake? Is it species displacement or species extinction?
It's displacement amongst, I would say it's displacement, not extinction when it comes to birds.
No real birds will die.
Well, birds will die, yes, but they won't become extinct. I think that there is data out there that suggests that some fish population might be extinct if these things are put in the wrong place. So, yeah, but that's kind of the key message really, is that we need more data to understand how harmful these things can be.
One comment here is just to point out that with the Tidal technology, it's learning from the previous schemes, which would obstruct the migratory pathways and would lead to those issues. And basically what is being discussed here is technologies which basically have learned from this in order to try to find something more sustainable. And we're mindful of those issues.
So you wanted to use it. We'll move on to Mike Reader and habitat regulations.
Thank you. Building on the environmental matter, we'll go on to habitat regulations specifically. Does the need to comply with habitat regulations present a significant barrier to development of tidal power in the Severn?
No.
Yes, Shaun.
Sorry, yes. No, I don't think that would necessarily preclude development. But obviously, any developer of a scheme like this would need to show that it can mitigate and compensate for any environmental harm that it does.
You need to develop quite a comprehensive habitat regulations assessment.
Yes.
And we've heard that there's still a lot of data missing. How do we avoid that plan becoming another bat tunnel and we over-engineer a solution?
I think you're looking at the report's conclusions in terms of advocating for more data gathering. I think that is, that needs to go hand in hand with any scheme that comes forward. So I think the kind of, any proposal that does come forward will need to demonstrate, as per the HABS regs, that how it's compliant. So I don't know if that answers your question.
It probably does a little bit. So one way of dealing with habitat regulation could be the planning and infrastructure bill and the ability to bypass regulations and using the EDP process. Would that help speed up delivery, or would that create environmental risk?
Well, it would, to my mind, it would probably do both. Yeah. So it would potentially speed things up by requiring a lower bar, which obviously we don't agree with.
Yeah. You could therefore get that clean energy that homes desperately need and people desperately need to reduce their energy bills.
Absolutely, yes. And I think like Thanis was saying, that you could potentially get, what was it, 5% or 10% of UK energy
that's
need?
if you push it, that would be, but with the Severn, I'm talking about 3%.
Exactly.
Trying to basically balance everything.
So I think there are probably, you could argue that there are probably less glamorous ways of filling that gap of 3%. Just thinking off the top of my head, a retrofit program for existing buildings. Stuff that's sort of less kind of impactful in media terms and not as much of a legacy project, but rollout of solar panels on existing buildings and industrial units or homes, that sort of thing. So I think this isn't the only technology available to address our much needed journey towards net zero. So I think absolutely no problem with it in principle, as long as it meets the tests as required by the regulations, would be our view.
We can look at comparators, and Sizewell's a good example. The schemes managed to restore an area of land to almost SSI levels to deal with mitigation on that scheme. Does that, this kind of latest case evidence of the ability now to deal with these mitigation, would that give you confidence in what could be achieved on the Severn?
To be honest, I'm not totally familiar with what's been proposed there, so I'd be sort of cautious in answering you, but I would be happy to answer after this committee if in writing, if that's okay.
I guess, go on.
If I can say, One of the challenges here is that we can do as much data gathering as possible, and there's always going to be a discussion on whether a project like this is compliant or not. And this is why there's a scope that we support a commercial demonstration project in order to learn from this. On the other hand, if you visit other sites, for example, the other tidal range projects that exist in the world. If you visit Lawrence, for example, this is a thriving ecosystem that you have there, and the scheme in Korea has basically solved a lot of environmental issues. Actually, the motivation was because it improved the water quality in Siwa Lake. So one of my fears is that we basically don't have a benchmark, and this is something that we need to set some targets, which we can then revise and make more stringent as we learn in this process, and basically understand what needs engineering developments or environmental measures need to be taken going forward. But at this point, if we do not develop something, we will never find what is compliant or not.
I think the other thing is there's already work that's been happening in the Severn over many years and some damage that's already been created. So wouldn't it be brilliant to learn from projects like Sizewell what they have done to actually improve the area and possibly restore some of it? And there could be possibilities like that. And I think the Commission and the approach that was taken was very much an open, learning, collaborative one. So if there are more people that we could learn from around this commercially viable project, then absolutely that's the way that we would want to go forward.
And just to sort of add, really, I think it's important that, organisations like the RSPB, I don't want to be sort of framed as kind of the blocker and the person putting the brakes on this type of development. All we're saying is that we have no objection in principle, providing that the bars are met, basically.
Yeah, so that's fair. Just my final quick question, I'll start with you, Sarah, if that's all right. So previous projects have not gone ahead because of environmental concerns over the construction of the projects and the impact the construction would have. Would this scheme and even a demonstrator scheme have that similar limitation and restriction?
I think the recommendation is there is a commercially viable project. The actual site selection is still to be done. So that piece still needs to take all of those things into consideration. I think what we've heard is we could all sort of continue to gather data. We could all continue to think about what we should do. We're just saying let's get a special vehicle together. Let's get some the right bodies involved in taking this forward, and it could be that it's GB Energy and a combination of the Crown Estates. And these are people that have been actively engaged in this project. The right vehicle to take it forward, but to actually look at something that is commercially viable, so we can do that learning to know what mitigations we need to take forward. As I said, the impact around the Severn, not only the energy generation, but the opportunity for jobs and a clean energy sector, the innovation for the UK, I think we're at a pivotal moment when we can be seen as leading lots of these things for the benefit. And as I said, if we work with our colleagues from academia and from the environment, as well as from the commercial, and as I said, you'll hear from the commissioners later, there are there's a lot of interest in this. There's a lot of private sector interest in this. If we can get the policy recognised and supported, then we've got some really good grounds to look to keep the momentum up. So, if we don't do it now, I suspect someone will be coming back to you in 5 years' time saying maybe we should do it then. So,
construction impact of construction works limitation, or is it not something we need to worry about?
So the way that those schemes of this kind were constructed before, you would have a coffer dam that would block the entire estuary. That was the issue that was causing a massive impact, but that was associated with barrages. In the case of when you consider a tidal lagoon, basically you can do this in stages in a way that doesn't kind of restrict the movement, and you can basically make sure that during construction the estuary and the area that you're impacting still remains functionally, and do this in a sensitive way. So I think there are ways, technical solutions that we can provide there, and the associated monitoring would help make sure that this is the case.
Just to come in on that, and it's kind of to reiterate the point again in support of what you've just said there. Again, it comes down to site selection. But in terms of a CDP, if it is decided that something like this is going to come forward in the short term, we think that is definitely the most logical solution as a bit of a pathfinder. Provided that obviously it can be environmentally deliverable, and that comprehensive pre-application consultation with relevant stakeholders commences as early as possible, at site selection stage.
Thank you. Young.
I wasn't expecting that one.
Potential.
I'm on 6.
There you go.
Right, I've got my piece back now. Right, there we go. So, if I can start with Sarah, what are the potential socio-economic benefits to the Severn region from the construction and development of tidal range energy projects?
So, having looked at this, depending on the site selection, depending on the actual size, whether you go for small, medium, or large, and that needs to be worked out in the feasibility study. There's potentially something in the region of 300. Let me just check here. Bear with me one moment. 30,000 job years for a small project, and up to 200,000 job years for a small project, for a large project. GVA impact 1.6 billion up to 12 billion. So as I said, one of the things that we really did take into account was that larger economic impact. We also believe that around 70% of the content is achievable locally. So these would be local jobs for local people, high value jobs leading to high value sort of manufacturing jobs, and giving the opportunity for the region to be a significant generator of not only clean energy, but the innovation and the technology that is needed for clean energy. So quite a significant opportunity. Based around place, as I said at the beginning, we have the second largest tidal range in the Severn Estuary in the world. As quoted by one of my commissioners, a freak of nature, that maybe we should be sort of harnessing for the benefit of all of the local economies.
What timescale were those figures over for you talked about the number of person years of jobs it would create, but I mean, what sort of time span would that be delivered over? Because once created, there would be a much lower level, wouldn't there, involved in maintenance?
So initially, and this will all depend on the feasibility, it will all depend on the site selection, it will all depend on the policy going through as to the timescales. Very difficult to predict, but you will have, some in the early stages of feasibility and work, and whether it's data collection, and then you have the construction, and obviously they're going to build up over time. But also by showing the commitment to tidal range in UK policy, I think what you will see is you'll see confidence in commercial operations locating themselves in that part of the country and starting to build up those supply chains, which could mean more opportunities, whether it's for supplying offshore wind. We've got quite a lot that is happening on that sort of west coast. It's very difficult right now to give exact answers because we haven't started. So hence it comes back to the recommendation of a commercially viable project to start learning and sharing and collaborating and being really transparent about how these things can grow going forward.
You talked about local jobs for local people, but will there be a need to invest in workforce development and supply chain readiness, specifically turbine manufacturer? Because at the moment, most manufacture is happening in China, I believe. If a tidal range infrastructure project is to be pursued in the Severn?
The actual details on turbines and manufacturing is most probably better question to one of my colleagues. But most of these turbines, as I understand it, are developed outside the UK, but the construction and the putting them together would be here in the UK, and therefore local jobs, which is why we're seeing about 70% of the content. The 30% is actually having to bring some of that technology in from countries that are leading in that innovation.
You don't see this as an opportunity for us to...
It absolutely can be, and we should be looking at that. But when you first, when you're going to start, we haven't got all of it at the beginning. There's absolutely no reason why that can't develop over time. The skills that we've got in the West are highly skilled individuals that have been in high-value manufacturing. The actual cross-skilling of them, the upskilling of them is absolutely possible, and we're seeing lots of those programs with offshore wind and manufacturing offshore wind down on the on the west coast when you look at the Celtic free ports. So there's always the opportunity to upskill more people. I think we just would need to put that focus. And again, with a commercially viable project, you can bring the suppliers into that and the supply chain into that and actually work with them very proactively. So when we look at the jobs, and as the jobs are going to be required, if we have the certainty of the policy, the certainty of the commitment, then there is absolute appetite from the private sector to work together on this type of project, to invest in it, both with skills and with finances.
One final thing on the economic benefits. In the past, when tidal power from the Severn's been looked at, there's been a lot of concern from the ports about the impact it might have on their commercial activity. Do you think that the potential benefits outweigh any impact on their commercial activity, or do you think that's not actually an issue?
When the Commission looked at whether it was a barrage or a tidal lagoon, talking to the ports made it very clear that a barrage would really hamper them from a commercial perspective. That was absolutely taken on board, and I know the Commissioners will be able to talk to you in more detail about that. And one of the reasons for the recommendation of a commercially viable lagoon project is so that we can learn and we can work and supportively, collaboratively with the commercial activities already happening in the estuary. I personally have been out to see the team, David Brown and his team at Bristol Port, for example, and he was very heartened that he had been listened to, their business had been supported, their concerns had been heard, and very much is supportive of a lagoon project because it wouldn't close off the whole of the estuary to his business. So I do believe that there's been a significant listening and empathetic understanding of those commercial businesses that are critical to the local area for jobs and also for bringing in lots of the materials. You know, we've seen Bristol Port bringing in quite a lot of the materials for Hinkley Point. So again, this is a great opportunity to collaboratively work with local commercial businesses to enable a viable project to be built in the first place.
Do you see the project as an opportunity to build up UK manufacturing, and do you see it as a way of potentially exporting and generating export revenues?
I think it's absolutely got that opportunity. It'd be really interesting to see the industrial strategy and where these things fit in that when it's delivered. But yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity for high-value manufacturing. We've seen catapults located down in Bagland, which is the Port Talbot site, where we've got lots of businesses who are coming together and actually really innovating together. So yeah, I think there's a huge amount of opportunity and potential with the right sort of backing behind it. And as I said, it starts with policy. It starts with tidal being part of the overall energy mix. And we can't underestimate that.
One of the reasons I asked that was you made the point about the opportunity for the ports, which obviously importing goods. I just sort of struck that seemed to be your sort of first option, do you see how quickly do you see the potential to develop a domestic supply chain rather than having to import?
I mean, again, once you see a commercially viable project, you'll get confidence in local suppliers and the supply chain being built up. I mean, it would be wonderful to say that we could manufacture all of this from day one, but I suspect that's not the case. And so building that capacity over time is absolutely a possibility. But making sure that any project that goes ahead, and the feasibility study and the commercial project needs to look at all of that, is protecting and encouraging local jobs as best as we can.
Yeah, Athanasios.
I think a commercial development demonstrator project would help with this, because it would provide the confidence to the sector that these are feasible. If you were going to go ahead with a massive, large-scale project to begin with, then that might not have the benefit you expect in the supply chain, because it would be just a single project. But a small demonstrator project that shows that this can be applied in other parts of the UK, like in the REC and so forth, that would provide an incentive gradually. If you do this at a small scale, that would provide a contribution. And also there are other technologies that are being looked at beyond the UK, such as low-temp pumped storage, and this technology could be used as a basis. This basically works well in conjunction with Tidal, but basically there are exportable components that could be looked at separately. So it depends on how you go about this.
Okay. Mike Reader.
It was just a request to Sarah, if you wouldn't mind writing back to us with the 70% local content and how that's calculated. That feels extremely high and optimistic from my experience. And having delved into other major infrastructure projects recently that have very high local content, when you dig in, it's quite hard to substantiate. So I would just ask, because that figure will likely appear in the report, that we have some substantiation to what local content means, if that's okay.
Yeah, and I don't have the next level of detail, but the commissioners might have.
Thank you. Torquil Crichton.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for coming in. It's great evidence. I think tidal range technology is the missing part of the jigsaw in clean energy. And if we can provide 3 to 5% of the UK's energy needs with projects like this and projects in Orkney, then so be it. But it seems to be strangled by habitat regulations, Sarah. You've wrangled 28 local authorities, 2 governments, 4.8 million people behind this, but the birds are getting in the way, aren't they?
I think our colleagues at the RSPB have come together with us to say we want to learn together. So no, I wouldn't say they're getting in the way. I think we're all of a mind that says let's look at something that's commercially viable so we can learn from it. We're really mindful that the environment and the estuary is a very special place. Nobody wants to displace birds or fish or any other of the natural habitats or cause any unintended consequences. So we could allow the birds to get in the way, but on this occasion I don't think we are. I think we're working together to bring both worlds together. As I said, for the supply of energy that we want as a nation to grow economically, to be leaders in this field. And this is just based on our energy needs today. Our energy needs, it would be reasonable to say, are going to grow over time. So, as you say, this is a missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle for renewable energy. But no, I don't think the birds are getting in the way.
What do you need from the UK government to get this commercial demonstration project into the lagoons? What 2 or 3 things do you need?
So the Commission has made 7 clear recommendations, but the top recommendations there is recognition in policy that tidal is part of the mix for renewable energy, and there are some activities ongoing at the moment, and again some of my learned friends from the Commission will be able to go into a little bit more detail there. We do have recognition that tidal is part of the mix from the Welsh Government, so it would be really positive to get that from the UK government. The reason that's important is it gives investors assurance and confidence that this is backed, and then a special project vehicle to deliver this commercially viable project, which will need some upfront investment for sure, And again, you'll be able to get some more details on that type of investment from my colleagues who've looked at the Commission. I think the important thing is here, the Western Gateway, as you quite rightly said, it represents a large number of people, a large number of constituencies. It wanted this Commission to be independent. Its findings were brought back to us, and it was on their recommendations and on their findings we've come to these. So I think there are, there are other things then you can go through the 7 recommendations, but I think if we look at 1, 2 and 3, I mean 3 is most probably recognising regulated asset financing as a way to deliver these types of infrastructure projects. But again, my colleagues on the Commission are far more learned on those matters than I am.
Sounds like this is why GB Energy was built.
It sounds like that's a good place for this to be.
Shaun, where exactly are the RSPB on this? Because you say there's no problem in principle, but when you write a drama, there's text and subtext. No problem in principle, subtext, anywhere except here.
No, I don't agree with that. Just to sort of obviously echo Sarah's comments there in terms of collaboration, and also, we also agree that with the recommendations report that national policy should be updated to provide a robust framework for delivering tidal range power. We agree this, in principle, as projects of this magnitude should not come forward in a policy vacuum, really. In terms of your sort of second point there, no, I don't accept that. My background is a planner, so I'm not I'm not an ornithologist, but it's each case on its own merit, and I'm an advocate of the planning system in this country. I think it's great. It's a nuanced way of deciding where development is best placed, and if it can be demonstrated that one of these lagoons can be put somewhere that is safe in an environmental perspective, then we would not object that. I oversee planning casework in Wales. For every planning application we object to, there are thousands that we don't. So, it's not a case of opposing it for its own sake. It's more advising a precautionary approach. And if a Pathfinder lagoon comes forward, I think, as important as the commercial and the socio-economic arguments are, I think we should also tie in the environmental monitoring. That should be front and centre before they're sort of proliferated wider into the estuary.
Okay, thank you. And Athanasios, just finally and quickly, because we're running out of time, what are the risks, what are the benefits for the whole of the Severn estuary from these projects?
Excuse me.
What are the risks and what are the benefits? If you can sum up for us the risks and the potential benefit of these tidal lagoons or these tidal projects for the estuary and for the UK as a whole.
Or in terms of the risks, there are, as you have cumulative impacts with those schemes. So basically, if let's say that we go beyond a commercial project, then basically the effects can accumulate, and it's important to basically do further studies in that point in order to make sure that these are within sensible measures. The overarching benefit is that you can basically get an immense tidal energy supply from this. So for example, the ring fencing that you did for tidal stream energy, which we work with those companies in Scotland, has been a lifeline for that sector to develop. But I do insist that if you want tidal energy at scale, a tidal range energy scheme is the easiest way to do this, and considering the benefits that you get in terms of the renewable energy. These schemes, basically, they say that they have a lifetime of 120 years. There is no reason why they should stop operating. It will be, as it has been quoted before, it will be a no-regrets option to invest and consider this, and basically establish at least a regulatory pathway that enables people to consider this more seriously.
That is a very good place for us to start to finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Can I thank our first panel for your evidence? We will suspend the session briefly for the changeover. Thank you. Order. Welcome back to the Energy Security Net Zero Select Committee. We have our second panel in front of us to talk about the Severn Estuary Tidal Commission. In fact, we have three members of the Commission who are going to tell us all about why they recommended in favour. But first of all, if you would introduce yourselves, please, that would be very helpful. We start on this side, please.
Good afternoon, delighted to be here. Sue Bartlett-Reed. I am one of the commissioners from the Severn Estuary. I also have an interest in tidal stream, which I hope will bring some capacity and knowledge against the tidal range discussion we're having today. Thank you.
My name's Andrew Garrad. I'm chair of the commission. I'm an engineer. I've spent 45 years in the wind business, and when I was appointed chair of this commission, I knew nothing whatsoever about tidal range, and that apparently was my qualification. I'm now a little bit more knowledgeable.
Good afternoon. My name's Chris Mills. I'm one of the two environmental commissioners, along with Dr. Madeleine Havard. My background, I've worked most of my career for the National Rivers Authority and the Environment Agency, finishing up as Director for Environment Agency Wales. I'm now retired, and I have a couple of voluntary positions, one with the Association of Rivers Trusts in Wales and also for the Institute of Fisheries Management.
So if I might very unkindly paraphrase, you know nothing about the subject. Why did you decide that this was feasible?
Right. What I actually said was I knew nothing when I started. I'm now slightly wiser than I was a year ago. So I think I was appointed because I have some 45 years experience of renewables, but it was considered important to have a clean sheet as far as tidal range is concerned. And I'd certainly discovered that there are plenty of axes to grind in the Severn Estuary on this subject. So I think that was probably wise. It's been a very interesting education for me, and I've learned a lot both about the environment and the technology and the politics.
So why have you decided it's feasible?
Well, decided it's feasible as a result of reviewing a lot of information. You'll be aware that I think we are the 6th or 7th study or commission. Pretty much all of those studies and commissions going back to the 1980s and actually beyond have come up with actually the same findings. It's feasible. There's a huge amount of energy. 7% of the UK's electricity is available in the Severn. It's certainly fairly straightforward from an engineering and technical point of view. The difference from our point of view is The recommendations are different. The findings are the same. The recommendations are different. And I think they're different because we've taken a somewhat different approach. The Commission has been very strong on environmental issues, so 2 of the commissioners are environmentalists, and the context is different. So everybody is now considering climate change, everybody now is considering energy security. So the context is different. Our approach has been, you could say, the Commission's own approach has been a co-design to look not just at engineering and money, but also environment. And I think we've managed to do that and reach a conclusion which is a barrage, although technically feasible and very attractive, I have to say, from an engineering and energy point of view, would simply be unfeasible environmentally, commercially, politically and logistically. What we've recommended is a lagoon which could be built and should be built in the short term. So I was very keen when I took on the chairmanship that I didn't have my report sitting on a shelf like the other half dozen that have come before me, that we've come up with something which is practical and feasible to actually turn into reality.
And how, that's a very good point. How will you make sure that you're not ignored?
Well, this is a very good start, I have to say. Thank you very much.
The whole world is watching us.
Yes, excellent start. I mean, I should say thank you very much for inviting us. Right. And I am delighted that we've managed to come here so quickly after reporting. So we reported only a month ago. To be sitting here with all of you in such a short term is very good. You may also know that the timing of the production of our report was extremely bad in the sense that our client was the Western Gateway, and the Western Gateway ceased to exist a couple of weeks after we produced our report. That was not a causality, but it was unfortunately a coincidence. So we are taking action now to keep the momentum up. In your previous panel, you did touch on this briefly. If you read the remit of GB Energy, you find it's pretty much saying that they should build a large green project in the estuary. Similarly, the National Wealth Fund, and we've worked very closely together with the Crown Estate. Crown Estate have been a terrific support for us throughout our endeavours in the last year. We can't speak for them because they're all still forming their new coalition, but it would seem to me very logical that this sort of project could be taken forward by that sort of organisation. Presently, we're trying to keep the momentum going in the next 9 months, which I think we shall do as we form a more cogent plan.
Okay. Thank you. Now, there has been criticism that your recommendation of construction of lagoons and not barrages, as you've just told us, is underwhelming. How do you respond?
Yes, I am aware of that comment. The comment was made, as you may know, by an ex-minister who had an interest in developing Severn barrage, a commercial interest in that. And there are others, and there have been a few naysayers, I have to say. Generally, I think our Commission report has landed well, but there is a real danger, had we recommended a barrage, which Chris on my left would certainly not have allowed us to do, but had we done so, I believe we would be back here in 5 years' time or 10 years' time with another report of someone saying, well, we could build a barrage and nothing would have happened. So we were very keen that we would come up with something practical and achievable that could result in action rather than just another report. I think a lagoon, and there's a discussion, the word small has been used several times. Small, in our context here, is a couple of £1 billion. So small is not that small. A medium-sized barrage would produce about 2% of the UK's electricity. A medium-sized lagoon, maybe that's a terrible slip of the tongue. A medium-sized lagoon would produce 2% of the UK's electricity. A large barrage would produce 5 to 6%. So we're talking big numbers anyway, and I think that's important to recognise that. We're not thinking about a little model, a little demonstrator. We're thinking about something which will demonstrate the principle, will demonstrate the feasibility, but will also produce a significant amount of low-carbon energy in a reliable form.
Yeah, and do you see this being repeated elsewhere in the UK and around the world?
Yes. I think you touched again on this in the first panel. There are no tidal lagoons in the world. There are two tidal barrages, one in France, which I learnt about when I did my French O-level 55 years ago. So it's still going with the same turbine, never been changed, and one in South Korea, about 15 years old. Those are two barrages. There are no lagoons. So this would be a world first for the UK. It would be, in our suggestions, it should be in the Severn Estuary. There are, as you're well aware, other schemes around, other tidal range schemes in the Mersey, in North Wales and so on. I believe that this could be the beginning of something very exciting. It could be the beginning of an industry, not only demonstrating the low carbon capability of tidal range, but also starting something which could become globally important. Maybe I could just touch upon the comment of local content, which was mentioned earlier on. An important thing to recognise here, I think, is that roughly 70% of a tidal lagoon is civil works. So 30% is the mechanical, electrical bits. So when you're looking at comparisons with other technologies, it's important to bear that in mind. It's somewhat different substantially different to wind, for example.
Yeah, well, thank you. My colleagues, I think, will draw your fellow panellists into the conversation.
Yes, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine.
I'll stop talking.
I rather sort of goaded you into answering once or twice there. You mentioned the Mersey tidal barrage, of course. It's not a lagoon.
Yep.
Should they be considering a lagoon rather than a barrage? I ask that as a city region MP, you understand.
I'll stop at these two. Our conclusions are for the Severn Estuary.
Okay.
Full stop.
All right. No, that's fine. That's fine. Thank you. I will ask I don't know, Sue or Chris, do you have anything on that question or any of the others? No. I will move on to Torquil Crichton, who's going to ask you the next set of questions.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for coming in. It's either underwhelming, or it's huge, or it's billions, or it's millions. But how feasible is it? Sue, how confident are you that the technology exists for lagoon tidal range?
Yeah, 100% confident. So we've seen the technology develop over a number of years, and what you have is effectively what's known as a round-head turbine. So they're very, very well established in terms of understanding how the turbines operate. They're engineered on the designs of kind of propellers and impulsion propellers. So they're very, very similar in terms of the design, in terms of how they extract kinetic energy from water. So that principle is very well understood. And we should also recognise that we've been looking at how to utilise tidal flows since the Persian times. So we used them to fish, and we looked at the tides and saw how we could operate our vessels and others by utilisation of the tides. So we understand the fundamental physics of tides primarily from studies over many, many years, as you've heard from other panellists. The technology to extract energy from moving water put in either a barrage or a lagoon is really well understood. So they've been operating in three barrages for a very long time. We didn't talk about the Annapolis tidal barrage in the Bay of Fundy, but operated for a very long period of time, was decommissioned in 2021. And the fundamental physics, the fundamental engineering is incredibly well understood. What differs really is how you put them into the receiving environment. So whether it is a wall, a large barrage that actually goes from one point on one side of an issue to the other, or whether it's actually a lagoon that goes from a land-to-land point and really confines water in a much smaller space. And that, I think, is where you're saying, is it feasible? We think what is feasible is a lagoon, because for the Severn Estuary, both from the physics, the economics and the environment, as you heard from the earlier members, that can work from both a commercial and an engineering perspective. So we must remember as well that we know how to do these things. The engineering of how to put things in the water is very similar to providing protection for ports and harbours, whether it's a caisson, so putting large concrete blocks in the water, or other forms of building in the sea. We are a maritime nation. It's something that we know how to do. So that element of the 70% construction cost comes from the fact that we know how to build things in the estuarine and in marine environments.
Okay, so to lean on Chris's previous experience, it's like a salmon net across a river rather than a bridge or a dam, yeah?
The barrage?
Or the lagoon technology?
Yeah, the lagoon encompasses part of the coastline. Many of the same characteristics as a barrage, apart from it doesn't create a barrier right across the estuary. But in terms of having impacts on water levels, for example. But it's much more localised. And it could be sited in a position where it would have much less impact on the highly protected areas which are within the inner estuary. So from that point of view, you can mitigate against some of the environmental impacts.
So, Andrew, we know it would work, but what are the big challenges you face, commercial and development challenges you face to make this reality?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, that's been one of the hurdles that we've seen in the past. I think it's quite important to distinguish this type of development from a conventional, well, not conventional, from a power station of any sort. So a conventional combined cycle gas power station has a lifetime of 30 years. Hinkley may have 60 years, a wind farm, offshore wind farm typically 30. This has an asset life of 120 years, so 4 times a conventional station. It has quite a long construction time, maybe between 6 and 9 years, a very long asset life of 120 years, and a big chunk of money to get it going. And so the conventional way of comparing different technologies, different forms of electricity generation, is use the discounted cash flow and look at levelized cost of energy. That mitigates very unfavorably against something which has such a long asset life. And so we've spent quite a lot of effort looking at the right way of funding and financing a tidal range project. We've come up with a solution, well, with the conclusions that the costs are comparable to offshore wind, rather cheaper than nuclear. But the way to do it is through a regulated asset base approach, which has been used by the Thames Tideway Tunnel, is now being adopted by small modular reactors and likely to be adopted by Sizewell C. We were shocked, at least I was shocked, and perhaps this was my naivety, but when we started looking at this, we discovered that 67% of the Hinkley C strike price was financing costs, and roughly half of that was a risk premium. So we needed to address, first of all, the characteristics of a tidal range project, and secondly, to deal with the risk and the way the risk is expressed in terms of costs. And so roughly a quarter of our effort has been looking at how to come up with commercial, sensible financing for what is essentially a big infrastructure project. And I think we've been successful in that. But there's work to do there, having established that that is the right process.
Are people interested?
Sorry?
Are people interested?
Yes. We held 2 sets of stakeholder workshops for the finance community. The first was developer interest, so would anybody be interested in developing such a project? And the second was construction, so the big bucks. Is the money available to build the project? The answer to the second is there are lots of people who would be prepared to finance, given the right circumstances. RAB wouldn't be included there. There are plenty of people who would be prepared to finance the construction. There's very little appetite for the development cost, which is why one of our recommendations is this project development vehicle, which we believe needs to be at least in part financed publicly to get to a buildable project. So some public finance investment is needed to get to a buildable project, then private finance can take over and build and run it for 120 years.
Yeah, okay. Sue, this may be a very simple question with a very complicated answer, but how do you come to this determination that tidal range energy will bring down wholesale electricity prices, particularly when everything relies on the price of gas right now, and the tide won't stop flowing, but when everything else stops flowing, we have to turn to gas anyway?
Yes, there's a couple of elements to that. One is the discounted rates and cost of capital. So over the lifetime of the project, you see the costs reduce. So you have this initial high capital cost to build what is effectively an infrastructure project, but it creates generation. So normally if you have offshore wind or other projects, your major cost is your turbines and your installation costs, and then operation and maintenance. There's very little operation and maintenance baked into a tidal lagoon. It requires very little maintenance. It has a very long, as we've already heard, asset lifetime. So the costs of capital come down over that time, the costs of energy come down over that time as you're discounting the costs. The other element that I think is really important to understand is, we talked about earlier, there are other forms, other ways of producing renewable energy that may be important. Tidal is predictable, and that has a value-added benefit to your grid. So you can find ways to actually reduce distribution costs. You also have generation that is close to demand. So the areas in which we're looking at potential lagoons, for example, very close to centres of habitation where there will actually be offtake of that power. So there's a range of factors within that are slightly different to other renewable energy projects. You have predictability, you have a long asset life, you have the reduced cost over time as the project becomes more established and is generating over a longer period. And ultimately it adds to the lower distribution cost of energy systems. So it can add value where other forms of renewables can't because of that predictable nature. And that's equally applicable for tidal stream and tidal range. But tidal range, because of the actual energy you can take out of a system and because of the way it acts on the grid really in terms of frequency, is really important in those costs and being able to look at the project as being valuable to the UK energy system.
Andrew, you started where we are with very little knowledge, but you do have knowledge now. So anything that can be done on the Severn could be done here on the Thames, or on the Mersey, or on the Clyde?
Well, of course, the Severn is rather bigger. The Mersey is much. The Mersey is. Well, we went to visit the Mersey. We know the Mersey people very well. I had the pleasure of steering the Mersey ferry as a result, which was a major benefit. But it's much well defined. It's very highly industrial. So I think that the feeling of the Mersey is completely different. There's industrial applications all the way along. I think that there is, wherever there's flowing water, there's energy. But we should recognise that the Severn is actually quite spectacular in the amount of energy it's got. So 7% of the UK's electricity could in principle be produced there. The national figure is about 12% for tidal as a whole. So I think starting in the Severn is the right place to go. And then it could go elsewhere, yes, of course. And it might be in different scales, of course.
Yeah, and you say it could be like 7 terawatt hours up to 21 terawatt hours. Presumably that's scale, is it?
Yes, I think we've got to be careful that we are talking about the right. We need to differentiate between the barrages and the lagoons. So it's maybe helpful to think about it in terms of percentage of UK electricity. So as I mentioned, 7% in principle in the Severn, 5% from a barrage, 2% from a big lagoon. It will be less as you move elsewhere, but it's an untapped resource. I mean, you guys have got to double our generating capacity in 25 years. It's pretty easy for people in Westminster to write that down, but to deliver a 100% increase in electricity generation with low carbon sources is one hell of a task. And so it seems to be quite contrary not to be looking at all the possibilities. They need to be done properly, and I think, Chris can come in.
I want to take up too much time, but Chris, you want to come in?
Yeah, I was going to just comment on your, could it be done here in the Thames? Of course, there is a barrage, the Thames barrage, but it has a completely different function. It's to prevent flood risk and tidal surge. And the important thing there is that it allows for navigation. So, again, one of the reasons why the barrage would be very difficult within the Severn estuary is that certainly the ports are very against it and would see it as an impediment to navigation through the estuary. So I think you've got to decide, what the other competing demands are in your estuary as to whether or not it would be possible to generate electricity.
Thank you, Chair.
Melanie, on, please.
Thank you. Andrew, I was struck by your comment about the turbine in France being the same for 50 years, but in our previous evidence session there was a suggestion that perhaps there could be some reindustrialisation that comes from tidal technology, but 50 years does not indicate that suddenly lots of turbines will be required for replacement purposes.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, it's quite remarkable that it's gone on for 60 years. And so as an engineer, I regard that as a great success. Maybe as a business person, it's a terrible disaster because it's too reliable. I think what I see as the industrialisation potential, and I think it's important, we should make a very clear distinction between this industry and the one you're more familiar with the wind business, where it is absolutely industrialised. It's become very sophisticated and very effective because of the volume. The volume is not going to be the same here. There's a big chunk, 70% is civil works, 30% is the machines. We had discussions with 2 out of the 3 manufacturers, and both of them said that they would expect to be asked or compelled to make things locally. They also said they would expect to be paid for doing that, so it would be much cheaper for them to produce them in Brazil, but if they had to produce them in South Wales, they would. These are big chunks. So this is each one is 20 megawatts. So it's comparable with the biggest machines we're producing on the wind business now. So these are big chunks of stuff. And it's just starting. The market, again, is much smaller, but we are particularly well endowed in Britain with tidal range. So I don't want to be suggesting that this is a repetition of the wind business. It's not. But it is a significant extra chunk of industrial activity.
Is it more like the nuclear business then?
Is it what?
Is it more like the nuclear business? They last a long time and you don't make very many of them.
This is a very leading question. Not like the nuclear business in the sense that I think the cost will be quite controlled, and I think that the construction time will be quite controlled. But it's a similar size. Yeah. We're talking. If you look at if we were discussing a barrage would be very similar in terms of energy production to Hinkley. The cost, well, what is the cost of Hinkley? But it used to be 35 million, it's now maybe 50. The cost of a barrage would be 33. So they're comparable, both producing a comparable amount of energy. The barrage would last probably twice the length of Hinkley. So, yeah, similar. And indeed, the financing structure is very much borrowed. So, just to answer your question, there would be a new industry. It won't be another wind industry, but it could be something which is very special to the UK.
Thank you. Could I just move on to environmental impact a little bit? Because we've heard about the Severn Estuary's ecological and environmental importance, but a severe lack of current environmental data. 2015, I think, was the last survey data the RSPB presented earlier this afternoon. Do you think that lack of information makes the development of a tidal lagoon completely unviable until we get more data?
The way I would approach this is to look at the consenting regime and what you actually need to get compliance with the habitat regulations. I think that's the crucial thing here. So what that tests is there an adverse impact on the designated sites and features? The first thing you need to be able to do there is you need to know what the condition of those designated sites and features is. And there is, some of that data is lacking and some of that data is out of date. So that's a critical thing to fill the evidence gap in with. But even if you're not able to meet that test, you can get a derogation. But you have to meet 3 quite stringent tests. First of all, you have to be able to demonstrate that there's no viable alternative. You then have to demonstrate that there's imperative reasons for overriding public interest. And if you can demonstrate that, you would have to compensate for any damage done. And this very much led, from the environmental perspective, challenges to my engineering colleagues to say, would you be able to get through the habitats regulations? And I think our conclusion was that you have a far greater chance of doing that if you can site your lagoon well away from the designated sites in the inner estuary and try to find locations where there is the least environmental damage. A particularly important factor that has plagued earlier developments has been the impact on fish, and particularly migratory fish, salmon and shad. And so one of the prerequisites is to try and avoid, if you're going to build a lagoon, anywhere near a river mouth or adjacent to an important river that supports migratory fish. So I wanted to give the message that I don't think getting through the habitats regulations, even with the planning and infrastructure bill, which might lower the bar slightly but certainly isn't going to remove it, this is still going to be challenging and complex. But I think I and my fellow commissioner from the environmental point of view felt that what was being proposed here, if we could find the right location with the least damage, then we would have a fighting chance of doing that. And I think also there's increasing support from the environmental sector that some of these information gaps, it could take years and years to try to fill them with the complexity of the estuary, and that what we actually need is a real-life situation to actually test what some of these issues might actually transform into practice in real life. And I think, I've dealt with these issues for some considerable time as a regulator, and I think the mood has changed somewhat from being totally against any sort of development. There is certainly still very much a feeling that a barrage is not feasible and would create far too much damage. But I think the idea of this commercial development project, there is a reasonable degree of support amongst the environmental sector for that to happen. And I think it would then demonstrate once and for all whether or not there is a viable route forward.
If I may, I think this highlights a really important point, which is around taking consideration of environmental and planning constraints in isolation. And what the Commission has really been able to do is look in the round across the silos of planning, environment, economics, technical feasibility, which I believe is the way that we should be managing the marine environment. It's a much more holistic way of looking at the approach to the marine environment. It doesn't mean that any of those elements should outweigh others, but it has allowed us to look in the round at how you could deliver a project staying within the environmental constraints. There's also the kind of transboundary issues around the Welsh-English coastline, the application of habitats regulations, two different regulators in terms of a barrage. Those governance issues are really important. And I think actually what a tidal lagoon would allow us to do, done at scale in the right way as a commercial demonstrator project, is look at how you work across those areas to make sure that you're delivering something that is sustainable, that meets the need of net zero, that reduces environmental impact, that can speak to policy and the planning and legislation that we have, and can provide an economic return. And I think it's a really great microcosm for analysis of how we do things better in projects.
Is it a model for a government department?
I would love to think so. As an ex-regulator from round 1 and round 2 offshore wind, I think we tried to do this in isolation, and I think you do need to think now that we are, as to Chris's point, in a different world. We have a climate crisis, we have a biodiversity crisis. We need to think holistically about how we do better.
I think one of the things we found from the various stakeholder engagements, the environmental, was that we needed a spatial plan, a strategic spatial plan for the estuary, not just for energy, but for everything. I mean, the fish don't know whether they're on the Welsh side or the English side, and I think quite often the humans are pretty confused too. So that's needed. I think that was very, very much a request from the environmental stakeholders.
Thank you. Sorry, Chair, for putting in
Melanie, please carry on.
Thank you. You have recommended that a commercial development project in the form of a tidal lagoon be pursued as the first step in developing tidal range energy in the Severn. What are the potential benefits of that approach?
Of the specificity of
having it as a pathfinder project.
We haven't actually used the word pathfinder. That's been used by Charles Hendry, and we've deliberately.
Somebody used it.
I know. Yes. No, it has been used in here, but
and
it's
I
not,
adopted it.
Yes, well, that's very polite of you, but it's not. It is deliberately actually not in our report. We've talked about a commercial development project because we all, I think, believe now that the time has passed for a sort of little model. The time is now pressing. I mean, you all have the 2050, your 2035 targets, you have the 2050 targets. If you're going to deliver something for 2050 with tidal range, you need to start now, and it needs to be significant. So what are the benefits? We've talked a little bit about the socio-economic benefits. You have a goal, or at least the government has a goal of net zero by 2050, which means doubling our electricity production in the next 25 years. Sue's described a few of the assets or the positive characteristics of tidal range. So we have the inherent storage, we have predictability, and predictability is actually pretty important. We will have a lot more wind. I've spent the last 45 years saying how wonderful wind is and how predictable it is, but tidal is even better, I can say. And it does have inherent storage, so you can have maybe 3 or 4 hours storage. It often is close to loads. Something I would love to have seen, I think the timing is wrong, but I would love to see, as Port Talbot is replaced with electric arc foundries, for that to be powered by a power station in the Severn Estuary would be fantastic. Something which is very topical right now as a result of events last week in Spain and Portugal is rotating inertia. A lot of nonsense actually has been talked about what happened in Spain and Portugal last week, and it actually isn't caused by wind, but the way wind and solar react to such an event is different, and we do need more rotating inertia. These devices would naturally have that rotating inertia, so they support the grid. So low carbon, grid support, frequency support, local jobs, and low carbon benefits, and I hope a mechanism to do this in conjunction with the environmental lobbies. And I think co-design is an absolutely crucial part of what we've been proposing.
And just a few words about where the environmental benefits would come. One of the stumbling blocks for the Swansea tidal lagoon was the potential entrapment and damage to fish. This would give us, and there was controversy about the modelling and whether it was correct or not. This would give us a real-life situation to test that against. So we would find out whether fish are in any great number sucked into the lagoon on the incoming tide, whether they're trapped there, whether on their ability to try and escape from the lagoon, whether there'd be damage going through the turbines. How will the ecology within the lagoon be affected? Will there be issues with sedimentation within the lagoon? Would it have to be dredged on a frequent basis? What are the effects on coastal processes adjacent to the lagoon? And the efficacy of mitigation measures, such as fish acoustic deterrent mechanisms that you could prevent fish from going in there in the first place. So a lot of these unanswered questions, which frankly we're only ever going to get the answer to if we've got a real life situation to test it against.
Just one final point, knowledge capacity. So we talked about export potential and building out future lagoons. You're building capacity in your workforce, you're building capacity in your supply chain, you're building capacity in the ancillary services. So whether we want to understand fish, sediment, or we want to understand electrical convection through the turbines themselves, all requires people and skills. If we build the capacity here in the UK to build tidal lagoons, and we have a demonstration project, that capacity is exportable globally to those areas where there is tidal range capability. So the socioeconomic benefits are not just derived from a single lagoon, they're derived from the knowledge capacity that you build that becomes an exportable service globally.
Thank Thank you. We're going to move on.
Okay.
Mike Reader.
I was just going to ask about workforce very quickly and shortages. But I'll leave that.
By all means, yeah.
Oh, thank you. I thought you said we'll leave it. Sorry. I mean, just because we were talking about workforce and shortages and timescales to get these people trained up and that really benefiting the local economy in Wales. I mean, how long do you think it will take to get a skilled workforce to do the construction side and then, you know, all of these other jobs that are yet to exist?
I think for me, it's less about how long will it take to upskill people to do the work. As I said previously, we know how to build things in the marine environment. We've built ports and harbours all around the UK.
How long will it take?
Depends on the project itself.
Have you got enough people?
Enough people is the bigger question. So it's whether or not we have enough capacity to bring that forward in the short term and other demands on capability. So the offshore wind sector, vessel operation, etc. would be part of this project as well. But ultimately, we do have the baseline skills and experience. It's building that workforce and potentially moving it in a slightly different direction to have capability in lagoons.
We've got Hinkley Point running down, of course, in the very same place. And actually, something which we should mention, there was a discussion about the workforce in the ports. We would expect all the ports to be involved in making components, caissons probably, both in the South Wales and in Bristol. So you're right, and there's a big chunk of work that we've done looking at skills and labour and what is available, what's needed. We employed the same people who did the investigation for Hinkley to follow on with our work, and that's been very useful. But it's definitely a live issue.
Thank you. Mike Reader.
Thank you. I was going to ask about funding and finance, but just before I do, if I could just attest what I've just heard, so paraphrasing. If we could find the right site, and we don't know where that site is, if we get public money to do the viability, and we don't know if we can get that yet, we could possibly build a pilot project, a commercial demonstrator project, which, you know, I'd say would take 5+ years, something gone through planning and judicial reviews of people worried about fish and everything else, and building the thing. And then you talked about, you know, that the purpose of that being to understand the impact on ecology, on operations, etc. How long would you need to run? Did you make an assessment of how long you'd run the CDP before you'd be confident that then this is a viable scheme you could take to the market? I'll ask Chris first.
You want to ask on the environmental stuff first? Yeah.
I think you'd be talking at least 5 years, possibly slightly longer. You have to think in terms of generation time for certain species, and generation time for certain species might be a lot longer, but I think you would obviously need to do some pre-construction surveys to see what your baseline was. You'd need to survey actually during construction, and then you'd have this period afterwards to actually be surveying what the impacts are.
Potentially 15 years away from being able to deliver at scale, if you think, you know, that time to deliver
10 to 15.
10 to 15, yeah, which brings on. So I just wanted to clarify that, because I was.
Can I just? You said that scale. Can I just interrupt there, because I've tried to make this point before. This commercial development project, demonstration project, is not just a little model. It is a commercial project, so it will be delivering at scale.
And the challenge also being you need grid connection, which I imagine this isn't in the NESO plan, so we're going to have all sorts of challenges around that. But I just wanted to clarify that, because I think we could get caught up saying this is a great thing we could do, but actually we're talking 15 years' time, in which case workforce challenges can be different, capacity challenges in the market can be different, and if I was an investor, would I say I would invest in a relatively proven technology like wind, or a relatively unproven technology like this? I think that's an interesting question for us to explore separately. But I wanted to talk about your recommendation was to go down the regulated asset base model, but obviously not for the commercial demonstrator project.
Yes. Yes.
What brought you to that position?
So can I just go back? You asked Chris how long he would need to make measurements on after the building.
Yeah.
And he said 5 years. Yeah. So it would be 10 years, we would have a project now in 10 years' time. So it would be 15 years to the second one.
It would be, yes.
Yeah.
That's what I mean, yeah.
So when you say at scale, this would be at scale. This would be a commercial project. So just we need to be clear about that. This is not just a little model. It's a commercial project. We could do it in 10 years. We looked at all the different schemes that could be used. So we looked at CFD, we looked at cap and floor, we looked at the public-private partnership, and we had a specialist finance company considering that specifically. I mentioned earlier on the huge financing cost for Hinkley C, and we saw what was being used for SMRs and Sizewell C. We came to the conclusion that for an infrastructure type project, which is what this is, it isn't a power station, it's an infrastructure type project, this was the right way to go. There is an argument that if we only did one, that maybe you couldn't afford all the overhead of establishing the RAB system. The expectation would be this would be the first of several, not necessarily in the estuary, but Mersey is already quite advanced. There are other projects around the place. So it was risk sharing. So as I mentioned, the 67% Hinkley C, 37% of that was a risk premium. So RAB introduces a way of cheaper finance, but also sharing risk. And that seems like a very sensible plan. I mentioned that we had two financial stakeholder meetings with serious investors who have done big power projects. They all, no, not all, almost all of them agreed that RAB was the right way to go. There were a couple who said they would much prefer higher risk, higher return, which is fine. And certainly if you go to RAB, you do move to a different investor class. There's no doubt about that, but that investor class is there. So we looked at the alternatives and we decided that the cheapest way of doing this and the most effective and the way that was most likely to attract private finance would be through RAB.
And in your recommendations as a commission, you said that Treasury needs to expand the application of funding and financing frameworks based on the model. What changes do you think you need to see from Treasury?
Well, that's a very good question. And what we mean by that is there is a precedent now in energy. So provided Sizewell C goes on, that it's likely to use RAB. SMRs seem likely to use RAB. So those are both energy projects. RAB to date has been used on some grid issues and also on the Thames Tideway Tunnel. So there is precedent in the energy industry for RAB. So Ofgem is already available, as is the low carbon contract company, already familiar. To be honest, I don't know whether this is a simple administrative change, a bit of cut and paste, taking out TTT and putting in tidal range, or whether it's a huge act of Parliament, and that's something which we are investigating right now. To me, it seems that if it's already been used for other energy projects to do something very similar, it can't be that difficult, but that may be a very naive approach. We are looking into that right now.
If I may, just a point on whether investors would come in behind an unproven technology. That's not the challenge. The engineering and the technology is very well understood. The only thing you would do with normal tidal range turbines is improve the efficiency. So they are at a similar level to offshore wind, except we have much larger capacity in offshore wind. We have a lot more technology in the water. In terms of the financing, it's very difficult to finance a project if there's no long-term policy to sit in front of it. So investors are uncertain about the intent around tidal range, and I think to the point of what statutory or regulatory changes would you make to enable financing to happen, it's very difficult in the absence of any national policy statement for tidal range. So that would have to precede any changes, we think, to the financing mechanisms. There would need to be an intent to bring in investors behind.
We're going to come on to some questions about that shortly. So that's good.
Do you want to build?
I just want to come in on that. I think, Sue, you mentioned maybe Burundi, and there'd been a decommissioning of a lagoon. I just wondered why it hadn't been repowered rather than decommissioned, or was something else set up in its place. Just thinking about, did they find it to be effective?
This was a tidal barrage, the Annapolis tidal barrage in the Bay of Fundy in Canada. And really, it had become less cost-effective over time because of the Bay of Fundy and some of the impacts. They hadn't really put the money in to make it more efficient and to look at the fish. So they could have repowered that project had they had the financing to do it, but they chose not to. The Bay of Fundy is an interesting point in case. It has some very... Bay of Fundy, it's the east coast of Canada, Nova Scotia province. It has some really interesting economics in terms of fish species, in terms of the lobster fishery. If anyone's ever savoured a Nova Scotian lobster, they're very high value. So it had a high degree of protectionism around the estuary itself as well. And this really leans back to the need for this integrated policy and approach if we're going to deliver something that is useful on all fronts.
Thanks, Rach. There you are.
Thank you. You've called for a tidal range energy national policy statement to reinforce government commitment and strengthen regulatory certainty. What discussions have you had with both the UK and Welsh governments regarding this recommendation?
I'll kick it off, then perhaps Sue can carry on. What we've found is, both from the finance community and the supply chain, that such a statement was an absolutely necessary but not sufficient condition. So really we're not going to be taken seriously unless that's in place. The Welsh Government already has such a policy in place. So we've discussed the Welsh saying, thank you very much, you've got a good policy. We don't have a policy from the UK government, and maybe so you could take on from there.
Yeah, so I think it has fallen out of favour, tidal, over many years, and has been lacking in policy structures. So we know that the energy system operator, NESO, is looking at what do we need to make the energy system effective, and they're recommending 5 gigawatts of tidal range or tidal power needs to be on the system, and that's a function of the predictability of the power and some of the frequencies that we were talking about. We're here today to talk about that, but one of our leading recommendations is that in the absence of policy, it's very difficult to bring in the confidence and the support of both project developers or anyone who would back a commercial demonstration project if it's not viewed as being an essential part of the energy mix. And we know we need to make a significant amount of changes to our energy system to make sure we electrify and that we can meet the needs and demands. So we feel that it has a role to play, and it needs to be written into policy, or there needs to be a statement around what tidal range could mean for the UK, and we're initiating those discussions. But without that policy framework, as we know, regulation is the what and policy is the how. If we don't have the policy statements that can sit alongside the statute, it's very difficult to be able to understand, or for anyone in a commercial development project to understand how they navigate that to deliver on a project. So we would be calling for a policy statement to be delivered in conjunction with the industry, which is much broader than this commission, by the way. The industry itself has been calling for a national policy statement through the Tidal Range Alliance for some time. But we think we need a policy statement to be able to support project development.
Just to be clear, you haven't had direct discussions as a commission with the UK government on this specific point about...
No, we haven't had, but there's a little bit of background here. Presently, DESNES is conducting, together with NESO, the National Energy System Operator, a systematic investigation of the role that tidal range can play in the national system. They're likely to report within May, so in the next few weeks. We detect a reticence in making any such statement until that NESO investigation is finished. We employed the same consultant to do equivalent work for us, but obviously just in the Severn Estuary, following the same methodology. So we have had informal discussions we've talked, of course, to GB Energy, to the Crown Estate, to the National Wealth Fund, and some of the officials in DESNES. But I think until that NESO report is finished, we're unlikely to get anything more definitive.
Talking about NESO, you've called for them to review their strategic spatial energy plan to include a pathway for tidal range energy. How would this help encourage investment in tidal energy, and how would that interact with the national policy statement you're referring to?
Well, NESO already has in its plan a small amount of tidal range. They're investigating systematically how much more they could have in the context of the need to double the capacity. I think if the NESO study were to come out and say, we don't want this stuff, it's very unlikely that we would get a national policy plan in favour. But I think, assuming it does come out favourably, and I think we have every expectation that would be the case, then I hope it could be followed by a statement. I'm out of my depth here a bit, but what I anticipate we need is something quite quick, stating that the government is in favour. I understand an actual formal national policy plan is something that takes some considerable gestation period to produce. What we've certainly found is both the investors and funders and the supply chain need that sort of policy confidence. And I think without that, it'll be very hard for us to go further. And of course, we have the usual conundrum of the planning horizon for this project is 10 years to fruition, whereas the policy statements, change more frequently. So we have to address that. But we have been told by all the third parties that a clear policy is needed, and without that, it'll be very hard for us to progress.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Panel 2, thank you for your evidence. Very much appreciate what you've said to us, and we look forward to ongoing discussions. And with that, we will end the session. Order, order.